Hello everyone, in this video we will be reading Unit 2 from Block 3 of MEG3 course, which is part of MEG program at IGNOU. MEG3 is covering British novel and the Unit 2 is the problem of narrative. Unit 2, the problem of narrative. The structure of this unit is 2.0, objectives, 2.1, is introduction, 2.2 is what is narrative, 2.3 is narrative scheme in the novel, 2.4 who is the narrator, 2.5 narrative techniques, 2.6 comparison with cinema, 2.7 let us sum up, 2.8 glossary, 2.9 questions, 2.10 suggested reading. So 2.0 objectives. The study of the narrative of a novel is a complex business these days. The way the novelist tells his or her story becomes important when we realize that there is no uniformity in the act of narration and that certain things are told in certain ways whereas other things are narrated in different ways. The narrative of Wuthering Heights has provoked wide-ranging responses and reaction from its readers and critics. It is obvious that Emily Bronte was experimenting and working out different relationships with narrative techniques and the various issues that concern her to enrich her text with multiple levels of meanings. The aim of this unit is to focus on narrative techniques of Wuthering Heights in order to understand how far these techniques contribute to the overall effect of the novel. 2.1 Introduction. The word problem is part of the title of this unit. Why is the narrative a problem? Is it a problem only when the text like Wuthering Heights is in discussion, or has the narrative always been a problematic subject? There are two reasons as to why I think that there is problem about the narrative. I would like to pause here and point out that whenever I'm saying I, it is basically the author of the text. And this text which I'm reading is from IGNOU's textbook. So please keep that in mind. Let's begin again. The first reason is related specifically to the novel Wuthering Heights. You will agree that there is basic complexity about the narrative in Wuthering Heights. It is not easy to grasp the sequences of events in the novel, as there are many narrators who speak from different time zones. It makes us wonder why Emily Bronte needed to tell us her story in such a complicated manner. The second reason is more general and addresses the significant amount of the work that has been done on the subject of the narrative. You may have come across the terms like narration, narrating, narrative, narrator, narrativized, narratology, discourse, meta-narrative, interpolation, etc. The meaning of these words are varied. The critics use them in context. You will come across these words when you study critical material on literature in general and narration in particular. All these terms and many more are today associated with the great narration in particular. All these terms and many more are today associated with a great volume of academic work that is being done in the fields of literary criticism and cultural studies that deals exclusively with the whole process of narration. Storytelling today is understood as complex activity that involves much more than the storyteller and the audience. There are many kinds of direct and indirect influences that work on the production, circulation and reception of stories. May I warn you that modern critics use terms like problem, problematic, problematize with caution, as these terms have been distinctly defined. What is narrative? The narrative is defined in the dictionary as a spoken or written account of connected events in order of happening. Gerard Janet defines narrative as the representation of an event or the sequence of events, real or fictitious, by means of language and more particularly by means of written language. This means that narrative is sequential. It is kind of storytelling. We are exposed to many types of storytelling in our daily life. In everyday life, the television newsreader draws our attention to the main story of the day. The newspaper or television advertisement is a story about the product. Novels, comics, poems, short stories, letters, articles in magazines, plays are all in some ways a kind of story. They are all narratives. So, our interviews, ceremonies, a police diary, a patient's report to his doctor, certificates, sermons, and jokes. Even the message on the tombstone is narrative because it tells a short story about a person, her name, date of birth, and date of death. Roland Barthes, the French critic who did significant work on the subject of narrative in the 1960s, writes, "The narrative of the words are numberless, able to be carried by articulated language, spoken or written, fixed or moving images, gesture, or and the ordered mixture of all these substances. Narrative is present in myth, legend, fable, tale, novella, epic, history, tragedy, drama, comedy, mime, painting. Think of Carpaccio's Saint Ursula, stained glass windows, cinema, comics, news items, conversation. Moreover, narrative is present in every age, in every place, in every society. It begins with the very history of mankind, and there nowhere is nor has been people without narrative. Thus, it seems that from time we open our eyes in the morning and to the time we go to the sleep at night, we are constantly involved with many kinds of narrative that go on around us. If we dream while in sleep, that too is narrative. It is as if many voices are constantly telling us many stories. All these voices, narrations, emerge from within the society that we live in and narrate whatever the society desires or cares to listen to. These narratives essentially are representation of the way the society looks at things, its beliefs, assertions, and interpretations. In short, its ideology. For a detailed definition of ideology and its relation to society and culture, read Raymond Williams' Marxism and Literature, Oxford University Press, 1977. When we talk about narrative in a novel, similar question arises: who is narrating? What beliefs, assertions, and interpretations does the narrator seeks to influence the reader with? Does the reader enjoy reading a novel if his own ideas, beliefs, and thoughts are complemented in the text? When we seek to answer these questions, we will realize that the narrative in the novel no more remains the simple act of storytelling by the storyteller, but becomes a complex presentation of many voices. Some of these voices are louder than the others, some in the forefront and others in the background. The reader may even find voices that are not there, those that have been censored, sometimes deliberately and other times perhaps unconsciously. The narrative technique. The narrative technique employed by Emily Bronte in Wuthering Heights is not only very complex, but it is also a radical departure from narrative styles that were being followed by his contemporaries. Indeed, the narrative of Wuthering Heights has been recognized as an experiment much ahead of its time. Before we proceed to discuss the many interesting features and the various intentionalities that are contained within the narrative of Wuthering Heights, it would perhaps be appropriate to broadly look at the narrative sequence in the novel. 2.3 The narrative schemes in the novel. I do hope you have read the novel by now. The text I have used in Wuthering Heights, the edition David Deitch's Hermansworth, Penguin 1965, all references hereafter will be to this edition. The title page of Volume 1 of the first edition, Wuthering Heights, a novel by Alice Bell. In 3 volumes, Volume 1, London, Thomas Cotley Newby. Publisher 72 Mortimer St. Cavendish Sequence Cavendish SQ 1847. Chapter 1. Lockwood begins the narrative. Chapter 3. Lockwood discovers Catherine's diary. The reader through Lockwood's reads the Catherine diary entries. This is followed by Lockwood's narration about his dream. Chapter 4. Nellie Dean begins her tale. Chapter 7. Nellie interrupts her narration and then decides to follow the story in true gossip fashion. Chapter 8. Nellie continues with her story. Chapter 9. The chapter ends with Lockwood observing that Nellie glanced towards the timepiece over the chimney and was in amazement on seeing the minute hand measure 1:30. The storytelling is suspended for the time being. Chapter 10. Lockwood is not feeling well enough to read. He does want to enjoy something interesting, so why not ask Mrs. Dean to finish her tale? Lockwood urges Nellie to continue with the narration from the point where she left off. In Lockwood's words, from point where the head had run off and the heroine had got married. Chapter 13. Nellie reads out Isabella's letter to her. Relic of the dead is precious if that were valued living. Most of this chapter is Isabella's narration of the events after her marriage to Heathcliff. Chapter 14. Nellie resumes her own narrative. The chapter ends with the coming of Dr. Kenneth to examine Lockwood. Lockwood confides to his readers that he better beware of the fascination that lurks in Catherine Heathcliff's brilliant eyes, and that he had surrendered his heart to a young person who was the second edition of her mother. Chapter 15. Lockwood is convinced that Nellie is a very fair narrator, and he could not possibly improve upon her style. Nellie resumes her narration. Chapter 17. Isabella runs away from Wuthering Heights and arrives at Thuscross Grange and narrates to Nellie her ordeal. Chapter 18. The opening sentence reminds the reader that Nellie Dean still continues with her narration. Chapter 25. Nellie tells Lockwood that the last portion of her narrative, end of the chapter 24, had happened only a year back. She says that she did not think that in 12 months' time she would be amusing a stranger with a story about the happening at Wuthering Heights, and that perhaps Lockwood would not remain a stranger for a very long. Lockwood urges Nellie to tell him more about Cathy. Nellie narrates the event of the past 1 year. Chapter 30. Nellie ends her story. Lockwood decides to spend next 6 months in London. Chapter 31. Lockwood recounts his visit to Wuthering Heights. Chapter 32. The chapter begins with the date 1802, about 1 year after Lockwood had left Thrushcross Grange, now Lockwood makes another visit to Wuthering Heights, meets Nellie, and she furnished him the sequel of Heathcliff's history. Nellie's narration of the events following Lockwood. Chapter 34. Nellie ends her narration. Lockwood ends his narration with his visit to Heathcliff's grave. 2.4. Who is the narrator? So this is the question. So actually this is another major points in this unit. So 2.4, who is the narrator? The above table clearly shows that there are many people who narrate the story of Wuthering Heights. It also shows that narrative has many intentional breaks. Firstly, there is the author who does not publish her novel in her own name but uses a pseudonym, Alice Bell. The problem of identifying the narrator begins here. The three Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, all use pseudonyms but with the same title. Currer, Alice, and Acton Bell, respectively. The contemporary readership erroneously thought that the work published under these names was the works of one person. Many Victorian readers of Emily Bronte thought that Wuthering Heights was perhaps the work of a man. 3 years after the publication of Wuthering Heights, Charlotte explains that since the little mystery, which formerly yielded some harmless pleasure, has lost its interest, and that since circumstances are changed, it was her duty to reveal the origin and the authorship of the books written by her sisters and herself. In the biographical notice of Alice and Acton Bell, September 19, 1850, by Currer Bell, Charlotte Bronte, the strategies that sister had devised about the publication of their work is explained. You will find that this in the Penguin edition of the Wuthering Heights that I have referred to. We had very early cherished the dream of one day becoming authors. This dream never relinquished even when the distance divided and the absorbing task occupied us, now suddenly acquired strength and consistency. It took the character of a resolve. We agreed to arrange a small selection of our poems and, if possible, get them printed. Averse to the personal publicity, we wheeled our own names under those of Currer, Alice, and Acton Bell. The ambiguous choice being dictated by this sort of conscientious, I'll pronounce this again. The ambiguous choice being dictated by a sort of conscientious scruple at the assuming Christian names positively masculine. While we did not like to declare ourselves women because without at that time suspecting that our mode of writing and thinking was not what is called feminine, we had a vague impression that authoresses are liable to be looked on with prejudice. We had noticed how critics sometimes use for their chastisement the weapon of personality, and for their reward a flattery which is not true praise. The pseudonym is by definition fictitious. It is literary masquerade. The uses of pseudonyms in the case of Bronte's sister was an attempt to deflect public interest from the private life of the authors. Moreover, as Charlotte points out, the sisters were aware that the contents of their writings may not appeal to Victorian sensibility, particularly if it was understood that authors were women. Charlotte is also appealing to the critics and readers for the impersonal and objective evaluation of their work. Implicit in the argument is the idea that the content of their work is more important than the personality of the authors. Thus, it was not so much due to harmless pleasure that pseudonyms were used, but rather to avoid harmful repercussion that the subject and its treatment may have generated during the mid-19th century. The strategy that sisters adopted to present their work to the world was indeed carefully devised. They were aware that that the contents of their work contained ideas that would shock and challenge conventional moral and ethical codes. It is worth noting that this feminist assertion is done by a negation of identity. Emily Bronte's awareness of the fact that her novel was to open up many uncomfortable questions and issues that Victorian society was not prepared for, and is evident from the way she narrates the story in her novel. After the fictitious Alice Bell, the reader next encounters Mr. Lockwood. He is the author's persona who will be responsible to narrate the story to the readers. One of the important assumptions of the successful storytelling is that the storyteller and his audience must be in complete rapport with each other. But with the Lockwood as narrator, the reader is not so sure. The pompous language he uses, the self-importance he projects, and his impatience that leads to the making wrong judgments and erroneous conclusions makes the reader quite skeptical about Lockwood being a reliable narrator. He seems to be an ordinary kind of a man affecting fashionable manners. A dandy. His language is artificial and full of conventional cliches. Lockwood expects the inmates of Wuthering Heights to behave shocked when he encounters the genuine bad nature. When real people behave in a real way, people like Lockwood, whose experiences in life have been structured by conventionality, are helpless and lost. Lockwood's predicament is a fair warning to the readers who are expecting conventional literary experience in the reading of Wuthering Heights. For the reader, Lockwood's story is engrossing, though the storyteller's credibility is suspect. The dream, for Lockwood, it is more of a nightmare, is something that increases the reader's curiosity. So does the diary notes of Catherine, which Lockwood reads by trespassing individual privacy. With Lockwood as narrator, the reader experiences the same kind of trepidation as one would if one was accompanying a trespasser. The reader also knows that the Lockwood was in the recent past failed to respond to the possibility of real relationship with a woman he was happy flirting with. This is the danger of his seeing things the way he wants to, rather the way they really are. When author provides another narrator in the form of Nellie Dean, the reader is more comfortable. Now, Lockwood becomes the audience and Nellie the storyteller. Nellie is an insider, and her first unraveling of the secrets of Wuthering Heights may be taken as unburdening of the heavy weights of terrible memory and not as prying into privacy. This shift from Lockwood to Nellie Dean is deliberate. It is a technique by which Emily Bronte is able to critique the conventionality of the male narrator and the male-centric Victorian consciousness that he represents. Nellie's narrative is extraordinary in its ability to capture every minute detail and its emphatic, breathless quality. It is as if Nellie is telling of events that had happened very recently. So vivid is her presentation. Nellie's narration takes her audience very close to where the action is. Since she has spent her whole life in the Heights and the Grange, she is not only the first-hand witness to its intimate affairs but also an involved participant. Though Charlotte Bronte saw her as specimen of true benevolence and homely fidelity. Few readers today would be able to accept her as that. Her conventional religious and moral sentiments, combined with self-righteous attitude toward those whom she had nursed as children, especially Catherine and Heathcliff, cannot make her an objective narrator, nor will the reader be entirely convinced, unlike Lockwood, of the moral lessons and the seemingly truth that Nellie propounds with self-appointed authority. The reader will always perceive more than what the Nellie can narrate or judge. 2.5 Narrative Techniques. One way of understanding the narrative technique is Wuthering Heights is to see it as the design of Chinese box, the story within a story that can be unraveled by removing one layer after another. A room within a room that reader keeps entering, in which the room are not only physical spaces but also spaces of the mind. Note how Lockwood enters Wuthering Heights. First, he is outside in the bitter cold and hostile environment. Then he enters the living room of Wuthering Heights, where the environment is warm, but his reception is not. Later, he goes further into the house and finds himself in the Catherine's bedroom, where he discovers her diary. The diary is the key to our entry not only to the past but also into the Catherine's mind. This progress inside the house is complemented by Lockwood's entry into the past I think I missed the line. This progress inside the house is complemented by Lockwood's entry into the past of Wuthering Heights, which climaxes with his encounter with Catherine's apparition. Back at Thrushcross Grange, in more comfortable surroundings, Lockwood's passage into the past continues with Nellie's recapitulation. This technique adds a degree of suspense and mystery to the narration and provides great scope for dramatic shifts in time and space. At the same time, past and present is woven together in the way Nellie and Lockwood interpret and judge the events they are witness to. The circumstantial ironies of the tale can thus be highlighted. This travel into the internal closed and dark world approximates the familiar narrative styles of Gothic tales in which the mind is turned on itself and the dark side of the psyche is exposed. But unlike their Gothic predecessors, the narrators of Wuthering Heights are shocked by what they encounter and experience because of the moral and official standards they represent. J. Hillis Miller, in the essay Wuthering Heights, Repetition and the Uncanny, points out that there is a line of witness narrators from Emily Bronte to the pseudonymous Alice Bell to Lockwood to Nellie Dean to Heathcliff to Catherine, who form this complex narrative. Reading the novel is like moving inside of the inside, or sometimes the other way around. Just as there are many narrators in the novel, consequently there are many listeners. Nellie has been the confidant of both Catherine and Heathcliff. Both of them have from time to time felt the need to confide their thoughts to Nellie. A letter from Isabella informs Nellie of the story of Isabella's disastrous married life. Lockwood is Nellie's audience. Alice Bell knows of Lockwood's story. Finally, the consciousness of the reader envelops the consciousness of all other characters, including that of Alice Bell. According to Miller, the reader is condemned to resurrect the ghostly past of Wuthering Heights. Different voices speak to the reader, and no one seems to completely comprehend the meaning of the events. The reader is aware of something familiar but is unable to grasp it or even articulate it. This gives the text its uncanny, baffling flavor. It is not very comfortable feeling to know that one does not understand what is happening around oneself. Conventionally, readers are used to stories that follow patterns of unity, of time and place and event in the classical Aristotelian sense. Unity helps in fixing the story and helps the reader to read moral and ethical meaning into the text. Are we not always asking, so what is the moral of the story? The reader or even the narrators wish to find some kind of unity of meaning. Nellie and Lockwood are continuously interpreting what they witness. By doing so, they attribute meanings which are colored by their own understanding of moral commitments. Most early critical readings of Wuthering Heights accepted the Nellie Lockwood desire to explain the central mystery and attribute specific meanings to the relationship in the novel. Liberal humanist critics like F.R. Lewis, who positioned Wuthering Heights within the great tradition of English novels, seek to read into novel self-evident aesthetic and moral values. There are universal human truths that the novel upholds. From this position, the Nellie Lockwood narration is seen as a bland and a prosaic recapitulation of the relationship that in essence is raw, pure, wild, intuitive, and natural, something transcendental and beyond the limits of reason. Universal paradigms were sought and imposed. The most common one was that of polarity or a binary, where the novel was explained as the creative response to the universal opposition between nature and civilization. The most common. I'm missing lines from this text. I think the line height is not good. Anyway, the most common one was that of polarity or binary, where the novel was explained as a creative response to the universal opposition between nature and civilization, intuition and reason, day and night, heaven and hell, real and unreal, order and chaos, and so on. The narrative structure as well as the form of the novel in this view was a design that heightened the sense of polarity. The originality of the author was located in her being able to focus on those aspects of human consciousness that were generally hidden from view. Very often, the novel was compared to drama, and shades of Shakespearean tragedy were discerned. Nellie and Lockwood were seen as spectators. One was sophisticated urbanite while the other was simple peasant woman. The intensity of the drama cut across class or intellectual barriers in the way the novel moves from the world of everyday reality to the world of spiritual reality. The author's unconventionality was in her ability to create characters like Heathcliff and Catherine, who defied present-day morality and social demarcations in order to achieve higher spiritual level of meaning and being. Wuthering Heights was a triumph of romantic imagination in its quest for an ideal that sought an alternative to the mundane and base nature of everyday reality. This romantic idealization was questioned by later critics who offered a different interpretation. Frank Kermode adopted the view that there were many truths that could be read in the novel. Many truths are represented by many voices of narration in the novel. Priority was given to the text. Close reading of the text prompted a shift from singular perspective to the multiple perspective. The richness of the text lay in the way it suggested multiple levels of meaning. The narrative pattern was seen as a technique which helped to open the text to multiple levels of scrutiny and opened out space for varied interpretations and responses. Nellie and Lockwood are not seen as narrators who take the reader to the center of the story, but are now seen as voices among many voices in the story. You could read Freudian or Marxist or biographical or symbolic or feminist meaning into the text depending on what position you took. The narrator's confinement to their own narrow understanding of what they narrate only brings to the sharp focus the intensely complex and the richly textured contents of the text. Finally, the modern deconstructionist critic would say that there are no truths that can be read into the text of Wuthering Heights. Deconstructionist approaches challenge any position that seeks to make a judgment. Its contention is that it is not possible objectively or scientifically to determine the truth about anything. According to the deconstructionists, any claim to truth or any absolute value is an assertion of a construct which is generally a part of social ideology. In this case, Nellie and Lockwood's assertions are seen as futile because the novel just doesn't conform to any value judgment. From this point, it is argued that the structure of the narrative is deliberate in the way it deflects the reader from arriving at any secret truth about Wuthering Heights. Since there are no secret truths and ordering principles by which the novel can be explained, any attempt to do so would be futile. This is not a flaw of the novel, but the result of very carefully considered structure that Emily Bronte designed for her novel to frustrate the mind's desire for logical order with the demonstrable base. Some deconstructive analysis suggests that the narrative is designed in the form of frames. The analogy is derived from painting frames. A picture frame encloses within it a picture, though the focus is on what is pictured inside the frame. The viewer is aware what is outside it and not pictured. The internal suggests and the external. The internal suggests the external, and it is for the viewer or reader to decipher it. There are various boundaries that define the limit of these frames in Wuthering Heights. There is the outer boundary of a time and place in which Nellie entertains her convalescent master Lockwood. The inner boundaries consist of the Earnshaw-Linton interaction with Heathcliff-Catherine relationship at its core. The narrators are framers. They encompass a story within a boundary, and at the same time they leave certain things out of the frame. Narrators, by the logic of this argument, cannot be totally objective, and they are always in the process of shifting, regulating, and controlling their material. Nellie and Lockwood keep surfacing as narrators in the text to remind the readers that the tale is theirs, which makes the reader constantly aware of the idea that there are things beyond the boundaries of Lockwood-Nellie tale. So the question that we must now face is whose story are we reading in the text? Heathcliff's Catherine's or Lockwood-Nellie's? It seems that we can never really know Heathcliff-Catherine relationship because they are not the narrators, except for Catherine's diary notes. The reader has no choice but to eavesdrop on Lockwood-Nellie confabulation. John T. Matthews suggests that the narrative frame is required because the central characters are incapable to utter their relation. Perpetually frustrated, they cannot articulate the relation that would bind them, and so they leave a gap to be framed and filled by the loquacity of the narrators. In this sense, the narrative is only an attempt, a feeble attempt at that, by Lockwood-Nellie to tell us of past events as they understand them. Moreover, there is also the point that Heathcliff and Catherine cannot define their relationship. Though Nellie Lockwood never searched for words to express themselves, they do not represent an authoritative voice. This diffusion of authorial voice and the inability to articulate their own story by the central character brings the novel in line with modern texts, where the problem of language and expression is explored time and again. In a close and deconstructive reading of the text, John T. Matthews argues in the essay Framing in Wuthering Heights that Nellie Lockwood's frame story aspires to bring the remains of the inframed story, that of Heathcliff and Catherine's, within safe confines. That Catherine and Heathcliff's love is the ghost of the prohibition that structure society. It has the air of unspeakably natural passion, even incest, the spaciousness of the escape from tyrannous convention, the heedless of the self-abandon, the dark allure of disease and deathliness. But the narrators are incapable of representing this relation. Conventional and self-contained as they are, they can only impose a frame that is product of their imagination and experience. Matthew points out that the subversive passion which is at the core of the story is reverted back to subservience, to the subversive passion. Again we will read. I missed the lines, sorry. Matthew points out that the subversive passion which is at the core of the story is reverted back to subservience, to convention, representation, reason, and health at the end of the novel by narrators in the way they seek to escape from the defining the core relationship of their story. Nellie Lockwood can only impose meaning and sense, whereas Heathcliff Catherine negate the meaning and sense. Matthews posits that it is impossible to determine if the core is more important than the frame, but there is a constant connection between the two and that one dissolves into another. 2.6 Comparison with cinema. Here I would like to suggest a correlation with modern cinema. Imagine a scene in a film where a character is telling another character of something he has seen in the past. These two characters are then framed by camera, which shoots the scene of the storytelling. Then the scene is projected on the screen in the cinema hall for the audience to see. To make the storytelling visually interesting, the director sometimes dramatizes the story and shows it as the flashback in between the storytelling. You will realize that our characters have a position which is their storytelling environment and their time and place. The camera has a position. The camera position indicates the meaning that the director wants to give to the scene in the question. A close-up of lips of the storyteller, a shot of both storyteller and the listener from medium range, and a shot of the house in which the story is going on can be significant in different ways and can be interpreted as deliberate intervention of the director in the way he wants to shoot the sequence of the storytelling. Finally, the audience too has the position in the seat in the cinema hall and must see what is being projected on the frame of the screen. The audience is also subject to the time and place, history, society, and culture. All these are interrelated but at the same time quite independent. Wuthering Heights is designed in similar way. Alice Bell is the director, whereas Emily Bronte is the invisible producer. The storytellers are Nellie and Lockwood. The readers are the audience. The eye of the camera is located in the mid-Victorian social reality. It chooses to show some aspects of it and keeps the rest of the out of its frame. The camera is sometimes very close to the narrators and sometimes dissolved into flashbacks. Cinematically, Isabella's letter is a flashback within a flashback. The role of the cinema audience is absorbing what she sees is important. One could have a total willing suspension of disbelief and believe in what the director shows us, in which case the thrill and the suspense of the unknown is what really matters. Or one can be very perceptive viewer and constantly be aware of the changing position of the camera from inside the room to the back garden and to the opening space of the heat to the close-up of Catherine's diary, etc. to understand how the director is manipulating one's responses. You are left with two options. To accept that the director must manipulate response in order to get the right reaction from his audience. Second, that all narration is basically manipulation of response, and that it is better to open up to many responses than to be coaxed into accepting anyone. I have used this analogy of the cinema to explain more graphically how the narrative technique in Wuthering Heights creates multiple perspectives and how that deflects the perceptive reader from arriving at any one explanation of the text. 2.7. Let us sum up. We must remember Wuthering Heights was being written in an age that laid great stress on meaning, sense, order, civilization, and progress. Perhaps that is the reason why early critics of the novel arrived at single explanation of the novel. The realistic in the novel was seen a veneer over what was essentially romantic and spiritual in nature. But in reality, it was precisely all virtues of mid-Victorian society of meaning, sense, order, But in reality, it was precisely all virtues of mid-Victorian society of meaning, sense, order, civilization, and progress that were being subverted by Catherine Heathcliff. To my mind, Emily Bronte was throwing a challenge quite remarkable in that day and age by creating a relationship that would resist being defined by the codes of her society. To begin with, Nellie and Lockwood fail miserably to define or codify that relationship. The author's triumph is in her narrator's failure. Nellie's story to Lockwood is her version of the real thing. It is her understanding and her representation. Narration is representation, but like all the representation, it is not the real thing, but an image of it, a copy. Nellie narrates her story both for her own benefit as well as for the benefit of her audience, Lockwood. Both she and Lockwood, as we have observed, are already positioned within the certain social structures of the thought and belief, which we call which we call ideology. This ideology colors their narration, by which they may not only misread and misinterpret some of the condition of their story, but also occasionally misrepresent things. What is meant is that ideology is part of narrative. One of the characteristics of the ideology is that it grabs people, mostly without their being aware of it. Nellie is primary narrator and has already been grabbed by the ideology of her times. In turn, her narrative grabs Lockwood. See how Lockwood never questions any of the Nellie's assertions or not careful. Lockwood would seduce us all to accept his narrative without any question. So sorry. I think I'm missing lines. Nellie is the primary narrator and has already been grabbed by the ideology of her times. In turn, her narrative grabs Lockwood. See how Lockwood never questions any of the Nellie's assumptions, assertions, or qualifications. Lockwood's narration is what the author is using to grab her readers. If one is not careful, Lockwood would seduce us all to accept his narrative without any question, just as he did of Nellie's account of the events. It is here that the pseudonymous is of vital importance. Nellie's impression of the events at Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange impressed Lockwood, who in turn has impressed Alice Bell, who authors the story for the publication. This brings us to the series of interesting questions. Is Emily Bronte suggesting that she has not been seduced by the story? Since this is not her story but Alice Bell's, has Emily Bronte succeeded in resisting the ideology of her narrators? Does Emily Bronte neither share Lockwood's ideas nor his kind of enthusiasm about the story? For her, the events have a completely different meaning that she would rather not divulge or find it impossible to explain. The answer to these questions are not easy, but the point I am trying to make is that there is a distinction between the narrators, and the author. Emily Bronte was aware of the distinction and is using it to critique the ideology of her narrators, which in turn is a critique of the ideology of her own times. This is not a new technique. Chaucer used it in the Canterbury Tales, and Swift in Gulliver's Travels, and later Conrad would use similar techniques in his novels. In all the cases, a persona is used for the narrative whose intellectual position was often questionable, and there was always the scope of arriving at meanings other than what the narrator was able to draw or suggest. Similarly, a sophisticated use of the same technique is used in Wuthering Heights. The narrative pattern is potentially radical in the way it resists attempt of reading a singular meaning into it. To the modern reader, the narrative technique in Wuthering Heights helps in the emergence of the plural points of view. That is what makes the text a real experiment much ahead of its time. And this concludes our reading of the Unit 2 from Block 3 of MEG3, that is the British novel. Unit Block 3 covers Wuthering Heights, and our Unit 2 covers the problem of narrative. I hope this might be helpful to you, and in the next video we will be covering up the next unit, The Gift of God, Heathcliff.